Of course, it would be the week I was out that there's a major revelation in the story I care about most, exactly how and where the COVID virus came to be, but I'm glad I didn't miss it, because although it's been forecasted by people in the know that we may never know, a new combination of pieces of evidence has what was once a massive pure tinfoil quackery now looking like a nearly completed puzzle. With all but certainty now, yes, it came from the Wuhan lab. Yes, we paid for it, or at least we paid the people who first became sick with it and quite likely made it. And even yes, with at least some likelihood, this wasn't even an accident. It may have been a weapon, or perhaps a weapon accidentally deployed. That last point remains a little unclear. On the first point, according to a new report, we now know exactly who was first infected with the virus, and appropriately enough, it was who, as in Ben Hu, a coronavirus researcher at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the Bat Lady's intern, effectively. In fact, Ben Hu is expected to become the next Batman. And there were two others initially infected as well, Ben Hu, Yu Ping, and Yan Zhu, all workers at the Wuhan lab. All the earliest known infections in autumn 2019, months before the first samples of the virus were discovered at the nearby seafood market in January 2020. So Hu, Yu, and Zhu were all the first cases. It sounds like that old who's on first bit.
Who's on first?
Yes.
I mean the guy's name.
Who?
The guy playing first.
Who?
The guy playing first base.
Who?
The guy on first base.
Who is on first?
What are you asking me for? I don't know.
Except in this case, it's more like who destroyed the world, but all of this, according to new reporting from Michael Schellenberger, Matt Taibbi, and Alex Gutentag through their Substack publication, quoting unnamed U.S. government sources with knowledge who say that who is the guy. And of course, there is skepticism warranted whenever anonymous sources say, but there are several other pieces of evidence that generally fit this claim. First, this claim fits previously published U.S. intel. Back in 2021, right before Biden took office, the State Department published a fact sheet noting there was intel to say that several researchers at the Wuhan lab were sick with symptoms similar to COVID in the fall of 2019, a contradiction of the Bat Lady's claim that now looks like a total lie that there was no infection at all among staff or students at the time. This new report simply reveals the identities of that original intelligence, and the sources speaking with the reporters say they are 100% confident in the accuracy of these identities. And of course, these identities are relevant because of what these identities do at the lab. These aren't janitors. These aren't accountants. These aren't caterers who bring over fresh raccoon dog and pangolin sandwiches from the wet market next door. These are all lab researchers who work on viral gain of function, as in making viruses more virulent and more transmissible. Ben Hu, as the Bat Lady's intern, worked on developing new coronaviruses and testing them on humanized mice. By the look of Chinese state media presentation, they weren't particularly careful about it either. In late 2017, 2 years before the virus emerged publicly, CCTV ran a profile on the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and hey, there's Ben Hu, overseeing a lab worker handling viral specimens, and neither of them are wearing protective gear. Later in that same piece, the lab's field workers can be seen cave harvesting bats, likewise with little protective gear. Now granted, I am not the expert on the dangers and the necessary precautions here, but the new report does quote one who says for this sort of work, there should be full body suits with no gaps. And so, apparently, we all learned to mind the gap the hard way. But there's another factor making it entirely plausible that Ben Hu is indeed patient zero. It's not just that he worked on developing exactly this type of virus. It's that we paid him to do it, because of course Ben Hu didn't rely on market demand to fund such recklessness. Instead, he relied on the greatest recklessness subsidizer there is, the US government. Now that we have Ben Hu's identity, we can cross-reference it with records previously obtained by the White Coat Waste Project by FOIA request in 2021. And oh wow, Ben Hu received 3 grants totaling $41 million from the USAID and, of course, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases under the leadership of Anthony Fauci himself. And the nature of the research funded was directly related to what would become the COVID virus. Quote, understanding the risk of bat coronavirus emergence. And we got exactly what we paid for, a very solid understanding of precisely that risk. And those are just the dollar figures that we know about, by the way. It's quite likely there are more that we don't, as Hu was scheduled to receive even more U.S. government funding through 2024 until that was cut off in 2020. So we know who this guy is. Who he is who. And we know that he worked on these viruses, and we know that we paid him to work on these viruses. But wait, there's more. There is also evidence to suggest this may not even be the accident it's always portrayed as. Was this all actually just a big whoopsie, or was this a weapon? Because after all, if the powers that be were so wrong about the geographical origin of this virus, why should we believe them about the intent of the origin either? But it's not just skeptical theorizing that may lead us to that conclusion. There are pieces of evidence to consider. First of all, why the military involvement from both China and the US. Last weekend, new reporting in the UK Sunday Times says the Wuhan lab was working with Chinese military scientists on developing new viruses just before the outbreak began. This according to US investigators with intercepted Chinese communications. One investigator quoted in the story says he believes many details and pieces of evidence are hard to recover due to military secrecy related to the development of virological biological weapons and vaccines. And it wasn't just Chinese military involvement. It was our military involvement too, or at least the request for it. U.S. researchers and organizations that subcontracted work at the Wuhan lab, like Peter Daszak at EcoHealth Alliance or Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina, they didn't just go to Fauci and company to get their money. They also asked the Pentagon. In March 2018, the Wuhan lab, EcoHealth, and UNC all applied for a $14 million grant from DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, to engineer what's called furin cleavage sites into SARS-like coronaviruses to study how this affected their ability to grow and cause disease. And it turns out, they very strongly affect that ability. In fact, what made the COVID virus so transmissible compared to its closest relatives was indeed its unique furin cleavage site. The Defense Department rejected that grant application, but it appears the Wuhan lab went right ahead with that research anyway, perhaps using American money designated for other things. All the while, the Wuhan lab very conveniently omitted that key characteristic of the virus when it first emerged. Absolutely no mention of that distinct furin cleavage site in their first report about it. Says the researcher quoted in the new report, it's like these scientists proposed putting horns on horses, but then when a unicorn shows up in their city a year later, they write a paper describing every part of it except its horn. And we're supposed to believe that despite their own formal request to make this horn, they were actually trying to engineer majestic wings for this horse or something. And the horn was pure accident. In fact, so accidental, they didn't even notice it at first sight. Now, of course, the military can be involved for purely defensive reasons. Military involvement alone doesn't necessarily prove weapon, but if we were involved for purely defensive reasons, why doesn't our government have more curiosity for our own defense? In the new piece, the authors write, quote, it's unclear who in the U.S. government had access to the intelligence about the sick Wuhan lab workers, how long they had it, and why it was not shared with the public. The researcher quoted says, you would expect the country of origin to be defensive, as China has been, but you wouldn't expect a country receiving the virus to be withholding key evidence. And yet, our government is. And not just this specific knowledge of who exactly patient zero is, which has now been leaked, but all of the other virus origin intel along with it. Remember back in March, Congress actually unanimously passed a bill to declassify all intelligence about COVID origins, and Biden actually signed it. And that was so unexpected and so unusual that everyone had an "I'll believe it when I see it" attitude about it. Well, very quietly, the deadline has now passed, and still, there is no seeing to believe. In fact, Sunday was the deadline for Biden to declassify, with a report to be submitted to Congress, though few news outlets are even covering it. By the law that he signed, he had 90 days to do it. But now, it's 90 days and counting, and the penalty for non-compliance is nothing, of course. There are no sanctions for not meeting the deadline, only political consequences in the form of increased pressure from Republican lawmakers. Oh no, not that, anything but that, I'm sure Biden is thinking. We don't care about pressure from the representatives of the American people. We care about pressure from the Chinese. Because after all, the Secretary of State is visiting this week, and we can't have Xi mad at him for spilling all the secrets right beforehand. So these politicians and these alphabet agencies have had this intel on exactly who and where this virus came from for years at this point. They just haven't seen fit to disclose it. And when we asked them to disclose it, they said, yeah, sure, no problem, coming right up in a few months. And then the necessary months passed, and still, they just haven't. Either because they want to placate us and hope that we all just forget, or because they don't want to piss off the people who actually did this because they're afraid of them, or maybe even because they're in cahoots with them. But none of these are good explanations for any of this at all. Meanwhile, they have known the whole time, but they've played along, and they've winked and nodded, and they've sometimes even made the accusations themselves that the people who suspected exactly this were conspiracy theorists or racists or other smears. If they don't want us to assume the worst, it would really help if they'd stop being the worst routinely. The world's certainties are no longer just death and taxes. Those are really the same thing. Now it's your taxes funding the death, actually. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Minds. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.